This program is underwritten in part by
Janelle Encarnacion Art. Carlos Furniture, a family-owned business, has been providing furniture, appliances, and household accessories since 1997. The flagship store on St. Croix and another on St. Thomas are both open for in-store shopping and are able to ship to various locations in the Caribbean.
and viewers like you. The views expressed on this program are not necessarily those of WTJX, its board, staff, or underwriters.
Welcome to the Bookcase. I'm your host, Shawna Richards, a sometime writer and a longtime reader. I invite you to join me as we explore the bookcase and celebrate Virgin Islands authors and talent. Each week on the Bookcase, we'll introduce you to a local author and learn more about them and their work. A storyteller lives in each of us, and I am so excited to give our homegrown storytellers a chance to tell their story. Tonight's selection from the Bookcase is the short story Ripen, and I'm honored to welcome its author, Ashley Molinar Bernier. Ashley, welcome to the Bookcase. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me. I am so honored to be here.
So why don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
So, my name is Ashley-Ruth Bernier. I am a seventh generation Virgin Islander. I grew up on St. Thomas with my grandmother, historian Ruth Molinar, and a big family of aunts and uncles and my mom who were willing to pass on a lot of my VI culture. I graduated from All Saints Cathedral School in St. Thomas and went to college in the States. Um, I returned to St. Thomas to teach at Gladys Abraham Elementary School for 9 years. And life brought my husband and my children and I to North Carolina, and we've been here for about 10 years now.
So you talk about your very rich family history.
Yes.
Did your mom encourage you to write? Where did this passion for writing stem from?
So my mother always read to me. She always read to me, and that's the best way to get children reading and writing is to read to them and encourage them to make up their own stories. My grandmother wrote several historical books. She was more of a nonfiction writer, but I always grew up seeing her writing. She loved to write on her computer. She wrote many articles and, like I said, some books about Virgin Islands culture. She wrote about her upbringing in Upstreet on St. Thomas. And so seeing them always writing, always reading, really inspired me to want to tell my own stories.
So your story Ripen is based on St. Thomas.
Yes.
Why was it important to you to center that story on St. Thomas?
So I find that writing for me is almost like a language. I am fluent in St. Thomas. I can write about places, I can write about setting, I can imagine the characters that I saw in my community as I grew up. And that's what's familiar to me. That's what comes out whenever I write. I am not fluent in North Carolina. And so you'll see with most of my work, none of it really takes place in the States. It's all in St. Thomas. It's all with Virgin Islanders. And so that's what I feel most comfortable writing. And that's where I feel most comfortable living in those stories.
I love that you say fluent in St. Thomas because St. Thomas is practically, the setting is practically another character in your story. How many, is this the first short story that you've written or had published?
So it's not. When I was in college, I remember being thrilled to have my very first short stories published in The Caribbean Writer, which is, as we may know, UVI's esteemed journal of Caribbean literature. And so that was really exciting for me. Back then, I didn't know that my passion was really mystery and crime stories. So my first story featuring those same characters that are in Ripen was featured in Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine, and it was called Rise. And it was about a stolen Johnny cake recipe. And so, yes, all of the stories are culinary based, and they all feature a food journalist and sometimes detective. Um, After I wrote Rise, I just loved living in this world with this particular character and the different people she interacted with. And Ripen was the second one that I wrote with those same characters, and that one was also a lot of fun to write.
What draws you to writing mysteries?
That is a great question. Because when I started, as I mentioned, I wasn't writing mysteries. I thought that stories had to be beautiful and lofty and dense and wordy. But when I found myself picking up a book off of the shelf to read, those were not the books I was picking up. I was not picking up the books about identity or um, you know memoirs. I was finding myself reading mystery and crime. I think it's because my mother and grandmother liked to watch a lot of like Murder She Wrote and those kinds of shows when I was growing up. But I've always loved a mystery, and I've always wanted to write one well. So Rise was really my first try at writing a mystery, and I had so much fun writing it. It was about food, it was about St. Thomas, it was about Virgin Islands cuisine, and it involved a mystery. And I just had so much fun with that story and writing Ripen and all of those other ones. It's such great fun to plot the clues and come up with the crime and plant those clues so that readers can say, "Oh my goodness, that's how she solved it." That's what brings me joy as a reader and a writer.
But you talk about planting those clues, and literally, ripen is very much focused on the
Yes,
flamboyantry and the significance that has in our culture. And
yes.
when I got to the end of the story, I was like, aha, I had that aha moment because the twist was was unexpected. So you talk about, your family watching murder mysteries and the stories you wanted to tell. Were you reading as a child? Were you reading murder mysteries or stories that were centered on our culture or that you saw yourself in?
So that's a great question because when I was growing up, I loved reading mysteries. I just actually did a presentation at a conference about writing crime fiction for children. And a lot of the books that I grew up reading that involved mysteries, because I love them. I mean, there was Nancy Drew, there was Encyclopedia Brown, all of those classic mysteries, but none of them featured anybody that looked like me. I always felt that like somebody like me, who was a little Black girl growing up in the Caribbean, I was a side character. I was never the main character. I never got to be the sleuth. I was always the
Mm-hmm.
sidekick. And so representation is so important, especially in fiction for children. But it's equally important for us as adults to be able to see ourselves in a variety of roles, not just my stories focus a lot on Caribbean joy, Black joy. Um, they are crime and mystery stories, but I never really focus on very heavy crimes.
Mm-hmm.
The crimes are always lighter, and the community coming together and working together is always a big part of it. Um, I want a Black woman, Native Virgin Islander, front and center to show that we can have our adventures too. And we're not sidekicks or side characters, but um, we are able to have those adventures. We can be the ones in charge. We can be a nuanced villain. We can be the crusading hero. We can be the intelligent detective. And so that was my goal.
And you wrote in Ripen what I felt was a very nuanced story because you had those elements of the the family dynamic. You had
Yes.
the elements of the relationship. You had the mentor. You had the villain who didn't wasn't initially the villain. So there was a whole lot going on in this short story. Um, Did you intentionally set out to write short stories, or are you just comfortable in that genre?
So I set out to write novels. Like a lot of people feel that as a writer, you're not successful unless you have a novel. I have 4 children. I teach first grade, and it's a very busy life. And so writing short stories definitely is a lot more manageable than writing a novel. But it takes a lot of craft too, because you have to fit a lot into a very small word economy. And so beginning with Rise is probably the shortest one of the stories that I've written with those characters. Ripen is on the shorter end. Most of my stories feel like longer short stories. They are long enough to live in a little bit and hang out with those characters, but short enough that you can read it over a couple of days instead of, the time it might take to read a novel.
What I enjoyed about Ripen, and you talk about it being, a shorter economy of words, but I felt that I had gotten to know those characters and wanted to see more of those characters. So, Ashley, you've got me hooked.
Yeah, that's
I want to
wonderful.
see
Yay.
more of what happens with Naomi and Mateo and the parents. I'm like, okay, where's her next story? Let me Google Ashley Molinar Bernier
Oh
and
my
find out what's
goodness.
going on.
This is so kind of you. I had so much fun over the past year and a half, 2 years now, writing about food journalist Naomi Sinclair. She lives in North Carolina, but she's never there. She's always on St. Thomas. She comes back home all the time. So she's always there. I've written 8 short stories that are a linked collection of her adventures. Each one features a different Virgin Islands food. For example, or Ripen focuses more on like our botanical prowess, but I've got one called
Hmm.
Slice that's about coconut and guava tart and the essential guava tart question. I've got one called Simmer that's about kalaloo, and it's about the consequences of feelings left on low boil for too long. I've got one about bush tea. And then I've written a novel length work with those same characters. So hopefully, uh, my goal is to get the collection sold and hopefully put all of them out there for the world. That's my dream.
Well, I heard you say that you wrote a story about coconut and guava tart, and I don't think you want to ignite the great tart wars.
That's a central part of that story. Yes, that one was a lot.
So, when you started writing, when did you first look at yourself and say, I have stories that I want to tell?
Oh my goodness. Well, a lot of us as writers experience something called imposter syndrome, which is that feeling that, oh my goodness, why would anybody consider me a writer? Why would anybody think that my stories are the ones that have to be told? But I think essentially it comes back to that same thought about representation. I really loved writing about these characters, and I loved sharing our cuisine with the world. Um, I wanted to I wanted to put that out there. And so although I didn't think that it was ever going to happen, I submitted Rise to Ellery Queen magazine. And this is a
Hmm.
magazine that's been around for a while, and it's considered like the big mountain for mystery
Right.
writers. I was really surprised when it got in. I was excited and thrilled, but I was extremely surprised. And even with Ripen, Ripen was selected by editors Steph Cha and Lisa Unger for the Best American Mystery and Suspense 2023, which is an anthology of the 20 best mystery stories of the previous year. So
And that's an amazing accomplishment.
thank you,
Congratulations.
thank you so much. When I heard that news, that was equal parts, elation and wait a second, are you sure that they really meant to include me? Like it was a little bit of that. Even with those successes that I'm incredibly grateful for and thankful for, I still know that I've got to try to continue to be at the top of my game and tell stories that people enjoy reading and stories that are crafted well. And so um, I I still believe that I've got some great stories to tell, and I'm working hard on trying to make them as good as possible.
So Rise was your first story.
Yes,
Um, Ripen continue, reintroduces us to these characters. Have
yes.
you started uh, submitting the remaining stories in your series to
So
other publications?
so currently, as I mentioned, they are a little long, and that unfortunately the market for longer short stories is a little slim. I
Hmm.
do have some other stories featuring other characters that I've submitted, and have been accepted in different publications. But my goal right now is to submit the 8 stories, the 8 linked stories as a collection. And so I'm trying not to tie the character, any of those stories, sorry, up with a publication in a magazine that might hold on to the rights for a little bit longer. So we'll see. We'll see how those go. I do have a couple of other stories coming out, as I mentioned. So there are other places to see my work while we wait for that. While we wait for the story collection to come to fruition.
Would you say that there are any elements of Ripen that are autobiographical?
No, so I do mention lizard food in that story. So um, growing up, that's how we always refer to it, as lizard food.
Hmm.
They're these little orange pods with these little red seeds inside.
Right.
And I've learned that here in the States they're referred to as a bitter melon, but growing up we always
Okay.
call them lizard food. So I always remember when I was about 9 years old, we were down on the beach and my uncle my uncle gave me one and he said, just try it. He said, growing up we used to eat these all the time. Just give it a try. It was I mean, when I say bitter, it was the worst tasting thing. Oh my goodness, I can still taste it in my mouth. But I knew that I had to include that in the story somewhere.
When writing a short story and knowing that you have an economy of words that you're working with, are there things, what did you have to leave out of Ripen?
That's a great question. I feel that for this particular story, I was very glad that I didn't have to leave anything out. I usually start with a theme, and the theme of this story was blooming, right? And blossoming. And so the theme had the plants, it had that relationship that was kind of blossoming and coming into itself a little bit more. It's the 4th story in the collection, so we've seen them kind of grow into this point. And and then it just had that whole idea of like a life cycle of like a fruit, something beginning and something going past its prime. And I think that luckily I was able to accomplish that with this story. I felt like I didn't have to leave anything out, but I continue to explore what happens next in the following stories in the collection.
What inspired you to write Ripen?
So again, I was I had already gotten this story with these characters, with Naomi and Mateo, and I was very excited about trying something new with them. My grandmother passed away in 2018, but one thing that I was very, very excited about inheriting from her was her book collection. She had a room in her house that was just filled with books by, about, and by and about Virgin Islands culture, African culture, and African American culture. She had so many books. And some of the books she had were books about Virgin Islands flora and fauna.
Hmm.
There were some that were written by Arona Peterson. There were some that were written by the UVI Cooperative Extension Service. And I just really dug into those books, and the story just kind of formed in my head. Those books inspired so much of those books inspired so much of these stories, the books that she left behind. And I'm incredibly thankful for them.
And those are certainly books that you wouldn't even be able to find
Right.
nowadays. So you
Uh,
so you have a treasure, definitely
Yes.
a treasure.
She has a cookbook from I think it's like 1965 or something like that. And some of the names in the book are, some of these prolific VI names that just reading them and holding the book in my hand, it's, falling apart, but it is definitely a treasure.
So, in your book and in your story in Ripen, you talk a lot about legacy, and there's that sense of looking forward, but also of the things that we've lost. What is the key message of your story?
Oh boy, yes. So this one, there are some big themes in this story. Um, the big theme in this story is growth, but also recognizing that um, things bloom and grow. And then the flip side of that is that sometimes, after things bloom and grow, they eventually do reach a declining point. For many people, like Naomi, seeing her father going through some health issues, and so she's seeing kind of the other end of this beautiful cycle. She and Mateo are at the beginning of this relationship of theirs, and she's seeing, the beautiful side that's growing, and so the story just kind of explores both of those aspects.
What do you want your legacy to be as a writer?
Well, I'd like my legacy to be that's such a great question, by the way. I'd love my legacy to be something that I feel has been left for me, not only from my grandmother, but from all of those VI writers whose books she had in her library. It's just a love of the Virgin Islands and a love of all things related to us and our culture. Um, I my characters are all like unapologetically Virgin Islanders. They love St. Thomas. They love being home. They love our food. They love our traditions. And I hope that by writing stories and leaving some of that behind for readers, that they continue to see themselves in those pages. That they continue to see um, all of the wonderful, joyful parts of being a Virgin Islander reflected in those pages. And that's my hope as a writer.
Well, I'd like for you to share a favorite passage from Ripen that gives us a sense of the unapologetically Virgin Islander that Naomi is.
Oh, that's great. I think I'll just probably read from this section. It's a mystery, so it's tricky choosing a passage that wouldn't give away too much. But I'll read a little bit of that passage that you mentioned, where we
Mhm.
talk about leaving things behind. Um, let's see. Okay, so this is after Naomi, who's a food journalist, has gotten a call from her significant other, Mateo, who's an EMT, um, that there's something going on down at Brewers Bay, and she needs to get down there to see what's going on. So I'll go ahead and read it. I note as I drive down the hill to Brewers that finding flamboyant trees for my mother won't be a problem at all. The hillsides look like Christmas trees, rich greens dotted with spots of vibrant red. When I was little, my father told me the story of two Virgin Islanders decades before, flying over the St. Tomian Hills in a tiny airplane and scattering hundreds of flamboyant seeds across the island. I love the idea of them tossing out seeds they'd probably never get to see grow entirely, leaving those gifts for those who'll come afterwards. I loved the idea of a plant being a legacy. Brewers Bay is lit up with an entirely different color. Both lanes are filled with blue police Chevys, most of which are flashing their neon lights. Officers and EMTs like Mateo fill the beach, talking into their radios and milling around on the sand. There's a group of them hovered down at the water's edge, crowded around a rescue boat. Their deep blue uniforms are a soft contrast against the aquamarine water, and their very presence and all the reasons behind it, a sharper contrast against the waves and the white sand. I pull my parents' Explorer against the curb, making sure not to scratch or smudge Daddy's new tires, and look over the shoreline. There have to be at least 20 first responders on the beach, as well as a sizable crowd of onlookers, and I'm noticing cameras on tripods and audio equipment. So this must be my people, press. There's a police officer keeping the civilian crowd closer to the road, away from the rescue boat anchored close to the shore. Mateo was right, this certainly is something. I'm starving, and it takes everything in me to ignore bunches of fuzzy sea grapes growing along the edges of the beach and make my way down towards the crowd on the sand. I'm halfway there when I hear someone calling my name. It's been a while since I've seen Keziah Hodge, but she's only become more unmistakable than ever. In the decade since I've interned at her fledgling online newspaper, she's doubled in size, cut off all but 3 inches of her hair, and dyed it a deep red. And she's traded in her contacts for wide frames the same color as her hair. Her newspaper's grown too. Back when I'd interned for her the summer before I left for college, she was struggling to get reporters, to get interviews, to get readers to check out her page. Now, the Conch Shell Chronicle boasts thousands of readers from all over the islands and the world. She walks up from the crowd and greets me with a hug that feels as soft and giving as the mangoes in my mother's tree. Yeah, Cozy's presence has grown plenty, but to me, she'll always be the person who welcomed a curious 17-year-old into our one-room office in the back of her sister's nail salon and gave all the advice and experience she could, like those 2 men on the plane, scattering seeds for later. I'll just stop there.
Wow. Wow. And in that, in reading Ripen, which I already said is such a nuanced story. You talk about legacy. You talk about the future. And what would you say? And that's what I got from it. That it's such a nuanced story that is really about people blooming where they are planted.
Yes.
What is the key message that you want readers to walk away from Ripen with?
Oh, hopefully they'd walk away wanting to read more, but just the idea of, I just want people to leave the story thinking, wow, that was a good mystery. Knowing a little bit more about VI plants and VI Virgin Islands plants and flora, and just having the idea of just that beautiful life cycle, that beautiful beginning, the bloom, and the end. And that's really what I had in mind as I wrote that story.
What would be your tips for any aspiring writers out there?
Oh my goodness. Well, I hope that there are many because we need our stories told. Don't be afraid to be authentic. That's my big one. I am a big proponent, of including dialect in my stories because that's the way Virgin Islanders speak. And we can switch it up, we can code switch, but we have our own slang, we have our own mannerisms, we have our own lingo, and it's important to include that and not to tone that down just to make people who are unfamiliar with it comfortable. Be authentic, include the people that you know, that you see, that you grew up with. And that goes for anybody anywhere, not just Virgin Islands writers, but anybody. Be authentic. Write the people and places and things that you feel and that you know. That's a big one. And then just devote that time. I had to stop watching a lot of TV. My husband will sit down and say, hey, you want to watch this TV show with me? And I'm just like, no, I've got to write. Sneaking in that time, my kid is sitting around playing baseball and I'm cheering him from the stands. And then when he's not up, I'm on my iPad, I'm writing my stories. Just finding those times that are convenient and sneaking it in and making that time. It might mean sacrificing something else, but making that time to write.
And I love what you said about being authentic, authentic to what you know and being authentic to who you are in your writing journey. It's been a pleasure to speak to Ashley Bernier about her short story writing. For more information on this short story or any of the books featured on this program, visit our website at www.wtjx.org. We appreciate your support of our local authors, and we'll see you next week when we take another book from the bookcase.
The views expressed on this program are not necessarily those of WTJX, its board, staff, or underwriters. This program was underwritten in part by
Janelle Encarnacion Art
and viewers like you.